It's a pleasure to be with you all here today to talk with you about the two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, religion and politics. As the president said, I'm trying to fit in a big topic into a short time here, but I just want to touch on a few things to put out there some of the things that are of interest to me that I like to cover when I talk and with my students, and perhaps get an interesting brief discussion going towards the end of our time together today. So I was really fortunate to get the funding from the University of Arizona, the Confluence Center, to travel the country, studying religion and American politics during a really historic election season. The Republican primaries were a really fascinating thing to study from the perspective of someone who specializes in religion in America. And this election season was quite historic for a number of reasons, of course. From my perspective, as someone who studies religion and American history, it was notable to have for the first time a Latter-day Saint or a Mormon for the first time on a major party ticket, and also a Catholic running as a running mate. A major ticket with two candidates that were not Protestant, did not have a Protestant heritage, the first time in American history. There's only been one non-Protestant or non-Protestant heritage president in U.S. history, as you may know, John F. Kennedy. Only one non-Protestant heritage vice president, which is Joe Biden. So from a religious studies perspective, this was an interesting election to follow. One thing that has made it challenging, and this is probably on your radar during the election season, was that conservative Protestant evangelicals, and Protestantism, as you may know, is a broad umbrella term for many different denominations and movements coming out of the Protestant Reformation. Evangelical Protestants, or a subgroup of Protestantism as a whole. Protestants make up over half of the country's population in the U.S. And evangelicals make up a big portion of the U.S. population, some 30% of the U.S. population. As you well know, this is an important constituency now in the Republican Party. Over the last 40 years or so, they've become increasingly important in the Republican Party as white evangelicals now, a clear majority of them generally vote Republican. So who evangelicals will vote for is an issue of concern. This was an issue of concern, as you know, in the Romney campaign. And if I make it to the end of this presentation, I'll show you how that turned out. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of perspective, evangelicals about a third of the U.S. population. That's in comparison to Catholics nationwide, or only about a quarter of the U.S. population. And Catholics are pretty evenly divided between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And then Latter-day Saints or Mormons are less than 2% of the U.S. population, although they're one of the most rapidly growing groups in the United States religiously. So evangelicalism, which is one of my areas of specialty, evangelical Protestantism, has played a really significant, influential role in the history of American culture, American politics, all the way back to the very beginning of the founding of the United States. One thing that is central to evangelicalism, as in most of traditional Christianity, is that it's exclusive. You might define it as exclusivist in that it believes that it has the only true faith, that it has the only true path to salvation and revelation. So there's this idea that you must have this personal relationship with Jesus Christ, be born again, in order to have salvation in the afterlife. That there's one narrow road to the truth, which is salvation. One thing that's distinctive about evangelicals, though, especially the whole 2,000-year history of Christianity, is that evangelicals always stress that government should not be involved in forcing people onto this one true path. That government should step aside because the conversion experience, which is so central to evangelical Protestantism, has to be entirely voluntary and authentic. It can't be an authentic conversion that's forced by government or military authorities. So evangelicals were very skilled at developing techniques to appeal to the masses. In many ways, evangelicals have an affinity with American democratic politics, and that it's all about convincing people that your side is right, getting people to come to your team and walk with you. Way back in the colonial period, before the American Revolution, evangelicals were a fringe and often persecuted group, not only in the pietist evangelical movement in Europe, but even in colonial America. One thing that always surprises my students when I teach American religious history at UA is that in the English colonies in colonial America, there wasn't, most of them did not have religious freedom. That religious freedom was something that evolved, especially after the U.S. was formed. In colonial America, for the most part, most colonies had established churches that persecuted people, forced people to pay taxes to support churches, just like back in Europe. So evangelical movement was a radical thing in that it was converting people away from the established churches of colonial America, especially the Church of England and the southern colonies like Virginia, which later became the Episcopal Church, or the Congregationalist Puritan Church in the New England northern colonies. But here's a picture of one of the most famous people in the 1700s, George Whitefield, who started the Great Awakening, which converted many people to the evangelical movement. And he did that through his masterful oratory and his very emotional appeals to a heartfelt, authentic conversion experience. It was said that he could make people faint and swoon just by saying the word Mesopotamia, or just his preaching style was just powerful to people of the day. In Boston, the whole city of Boston would come out day after day to hear him preaching out in the woods. So this was a real threat to the established churches in America. But even to this day, evangelicals continue those techniques of making people voluntarily want to come to hear the preachers, the music, the performance. It draws thousands of people into the mega churches and so on. So those techniques have carried on. Excuse me, oops. Uh-oh, malfunction.
Sergeant. Yeah.
Sergeant. That's a Super Bowl. Press the button. Oh, there it is. We needed her at the Super Bowl on Sunday, right? Yeah. Okay, so you have evangelicals creating this new voluntary movement, religious movement in America, and the established churches in the American colonies push back. And you have this long debate in the early United States over what the role of church and state should be. The very year that Thomas Jefferson is the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, he gets a petition from Baptists in Virginia, who are one of the major evangelical groups that are growing through this massive Great Awakening movement. He gets a petition from them asking that they be granted religious freedom in Virginia because the Church of England is still established there. Here's an image from 1778 of Baptists being dunked and harassed in Virginia for preaching outside of the Anglican Church of England. So you have a situation of actual harassment, religious persecution, evangelical preachers being jailed without a license, and so on, even as the United States is being formed. So Virginia is one of the first places to have a long debate over the relationship of church and state. Thomas Jefferson and his big ally, James Madison, take up the cause of persecuted evangelicals to demand an end to the established Church of England in Virginia. Patrick Henry and other Anglicans oppose this. Patrick Henry wants continued state support for Christianity in Virginia. But after a 9-year debate going into the early U.S. period, Jefferson and Madison win the day. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, is disestablished, and Baptists and other evangelicals gain religious freedom in that state. Then the debate goes national. When the U.S. Constitution is ratified the year after the Virginia debates in 1787, Baptists and other fringe Christian groups who had been persecuted oppose the Constitution because it doesn't yet have the Bill of Rights. And John Leland, a famous Baptist leader of the time, Baptist evangelical leader, writes saying that the Constitution did not protect what is dearest of all, religious liberty. And so again, their allies in government, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and so on, take up the cause to guarantee religious freedom in the U.S. Constitution. And finally, by 1791, this is years after the United States has been formed, there's finally a guarantee that there's not going to be an established church, at least at the federal level, and that the federal government is not going to impede religious freedom. When Thomas Jefferson becomes president, then his longtime Baptist supporters, evangelical supporters, write him to ask what his interpretation of the First Amendment's religion clauses are, and that's where the famous phrase, separation between church and state, comes from. The letter that Thomas Jefferson writes to the Baptists, rejoicing with them that the First Amendment had, in Jefferson's word, built a wall of separation between church and state. So early on, evangelicals were really influential in American culture and politics, primarily with this idea that people could take care of religion on their own. They didn't need government involved in making religion happen and succeed in society, that individuals and communities could take care of that on their own without government interference. And they proved their point. Right after religion is disestablished by the First Amendment, you have a massive growth of religion, especially evangelicalism, in American culture. Those dates there at the bottom are 1820, 1860, and you can just see this massive growth. The blue and the green represent the two major evangelical denominations of American history, the Baptists and the Methodists, comprising most of the religious growth in this time period. And this time of massive religious growth in American religious history is called the Second Great Awakening, where the vast majority of Americans become evangelical Protestants, and they really are at the heart of American culture and politics during the 19th century. And there you can see them all having that heartfelt conversion experience, which is this very powerful, overwhelming experience of overnight sort of becoming a new person through conversion. Okay, so that's a little bit about evangelicalism and its origins in American culture and its influence on early American history. The picture, of course, is much more complicated today, and there's just this, we're skipping over 150 years or so here. But today, you have what some people call a conservative resurgence among evangelicals since the 1970s. There was a period in the mid-20th century where conservative evangelicals kind of retreated from American politics. There were internal divisions in Protestantism complicating the scene. But since the 1970s, evangelicals have been repoliticized, and especially since 1979, 1980, conservative evangelicals have really moved en masse into the Republican Party and become a major constituency of the Republican Party. So you have groups that were really instrumental in making this happen. Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority was really crucially important in politicizing evangelicals in the late 1970s into the 1980s, helping evangelicals make the switch from voting for Jimmy Carter in 1976 to most of them voting for Ronald Reagan in 1980 and remaining loyal to the Republican Party after that point. And other important organizations building an infrastructure to bring conservative evangelicals into American public discourse. And you have a whole range of lobbying organizations, think tanks, organizations that are continuing to build a coalition of conservatives who try to bring their vision into American public life, into American politics. In some ways, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which was founded by Ralph Reed in 2009, shortly after President Obama took office, is sort of the new Christian coalition. Ralph Reed was a top leader of the Christian coalition in the past, now he leads the Faith and Freedom Coalition. trying to build a broad coalition of social conservatives to continue to have a role in having an impact on American politics. One of the things driving a lot of social conservatives today, and most of the people I talked with very much prefer the term social conservative to describe the movement than the term the Christian right. Older people, including Phyllis Schlafly, didn't have a problem with the term the Christian right, but younger generation activists, realize that there's a pejorative sort of use of that term and prefer social conservative. But the idea is that the United States has really gotten off track, that its laws no longer reflect the biblical principles that they value, the higher law of God. Some of you, a few years back, may have seen this. I saw this around Tucson a few years back, this billboard, the real Supreme Court meets up here, this message from God, that the Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century were off base and didn't reflect a true understanding of either the Constitution or biblical principles. In the view of social conservatives, the Constitution and biblical principles as they understand them are in harmony, and interpretations of the Constitution that move away from their understanding of biblical principles are the improper interpretations of the Constitution. So one thing that I'm writing about right now is how conservative evangelicals move back and forth between the religious world and political world, and have sort of two different orthodoxies that aren't entirely the same. And with their political orthodoxy, they've been able to define that separately from their religious convictions enough that they're able to build coalitions with people who don't share their same religious faith or their same religious dogma, so to speak. So their religious orthodoxy for most conservative evangelicals is the idea of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible's without error, and there's a whole complex theology and evangelical scholarship to support that particular approach to the Bible. Might make conservative evangelicals more likely to oppose the theory of evolution as it's taught in public centers today and so on. But then there's the political orthodoxy, which they share more broadly with other people outside of their religious enclave. So the focus on limited government, recriminalizing abortion, defining marriages between one man and one woman. Those have become some of the core goals of the political movement, making it possible to build connections with people who in the past, and maybe to the present day, they were suspicious of because of their different religious beliefs. So the big question for people following religion and politics was, would evangelicals vote for a Latter-day Saint or a Mormon for president? And when I went to the Faith and Freedom Coalition conference in summer 2011, before the Republican primaries, I heard over and over again that evangelicals would not vote for a Mormon, that there was a lot of efforts underway to prevent Mitt Romney from capturing the Republican nomination because, among other things, but one issue of concern was his religious faith. By this point, evangelicals have pretty much accepted voting for Catholics since at least the 1990s, but still there is this real unease with Mitt Romney's faith. And of course, this is nationwide. The Faith and Freedom Coalition was in Washington, D.C. I think evangelical conservatives in Arizona are much more complex in their relationship with Mormons because of the higher percentage of Mormons out here. And they've worked with them more closely for a longer period of time in this region of the country than nationally. So one thing that this new sort of political movement, new in terms of broad scope of history, as in the last 50 years, is that it's had the effect of overcoming some level of anti-Catholicism that was a long part of American Protestant history. And I think the recent election was important in helping evangelicals overcome some of their hesitation about working with Mormons as well towards shared goals. So certainly we've come a long way since the 1960 election. where you had leading evangelicals like Billy Graham, working closely with Richard Nixon and sort of working behind the scenes with other Protestant leaders to try to prevent a Catholic from taking the office and winning the presidential election, opposing John F. Kennedy's bid for presidency, which he, of course, won. But since the 1970s, especially since Roe v. Wade in 1973, evangelicals and Catholics have joined forces to work for shared political goals. And so since this organization, Evangelicals and Catholics Together, was formed in '94, evangelicals don't really, for the most part, don't really blink an eye voting for Catholics anymore. The big issue was overcoming the suspicion of Mormonism in this election. One thing that came out in June of 2012 was that the sort of anti-Mormon vote was unchanged since 1967, when Mitt Romney's father ran for the presidential nomination. You had the same number of people saying they wouldn't vote for Mormon as people were saying in 2012 when Mitt Romney was running. So it was a very real concern for the campaign. Interestingly, Billy Graham, who's still alive and out there, gave all but an explicit endorsement of Mitt Romney during this campaign season, showing quite a change from his role in the 1960 campaign. You may have seen in the news, it was widely publicized, that on Billy Graham's website, Mormonism was listed as a cult, but right before the election, he moved Mormonism from the cult list and took out the New York Times, urging people to vote for biblical values, which most social conservatives see as being more closely aligned with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And this is my final slide here, and I'll open it up for discussion. This movement to highlight Romney's shared values with evangelical social conservatives apparently was successful. Evangelicals supported Mitt Romney at the same level that they supported fellow evangelical like George W. Bush in the 2004 election. So this was, I think, a really important moment in the history of Protestant Mormon relations and their willingness to work across a broader coalition in achieving shared goals in the social conservative movement. So that's all I have to say at this point, but I thought I'd open it up in case there's other issues or clarifications that people would like to bring up.
Steve, go ahead.
In the 1976, 1980, I think you said there was a switch. Evangelical might have been more associated with the Democratic Party, and then there was more of an embracing of the Republican Party. What caused that switch?
Right.
Was it a political issue?
Yes. I think in many ways during the 1970s that both the Democratic Party and the Republican parties were sort of reconfiguring their platforms and what they stood for. The evangelical enthusiasm for Jimmy Carter was cooled after he took office, and he didn't seem to support some of the issues that were really galvanizing them to start voting again, like opposing Roe v. Wade, opposing the 1962 Engel versus Vitale decision that said that prayer couldn't be required in schools anymore, all those kinds of issues that had started to mobilize evangelicals. The Democratic Party didn't seem to be taking those on as issues that it was going to oppose. The Republican Party increasingly made its platform an anti-abortion platform, a platform that addressed the social issues that were really mobilizing evangelicals to get politically active. Before the 1970s, there were a large number of evangelicals that weren't even voting or even engaged in the political process. And so part of it was just larger numbers getting involved in politics again, which the Republican Party capitalized on.
Question. Your program kind of, well, not kind of, but absolutely focused on the evangelicals and the Protestants and the Republicans. Do you have any insight or any analysis on how the conflict might be, or might conflicts arise between Democrat politicians of the Catholic faith and how they relate to their own church dogma?
Right. So I think the general feeling among a lot of Catholics, and those of you that have connections to the Catholic Church might be aware of this in your own communities, there's this sense that the Democratic Party more closely aligns with the economic social justice vision that Catholics have in the social justice teachings of the church. And so people more oriented towards that strain of Catholicism might find themselves more comfortable with the Democratic Party. Whereas more conservative Catholics who are more concerned about the issues around abortion, reproduction, sexuality, all those kinds of issues, then at least when it comes to issues of social concern, will of course gravitate towards the Republican Party. So there's not a party that perfectly fits the whole gamut of Catholic ethical teachings. And so Catholics, I think, are sort of evenly divided depending on what they find most compelling in terms of social vision and so on.
Question?
Thank you for your presentation. Have you gained any insights that evangelicals talk about the salvation and the alignment with declaring Jesus Christ? If Jesus Christ is prominent in their lives, why are they declaring social issue, social caring issues that Democrats tend to speak more about? Why are they against that? I mean, Jesus was a socialist.
Right. Well, and that's certainly what, I mean, there's plenty of evangelicals and Protestants who are more on the left of the spectrum. I mean, it's not a very big sort of spectrum. I mean, it's not like the radical left, but are more to the left of these Republican evangelicals that would say those things. The response that I would hear from conservative evangelicals was that they could care about those things, but they believe that the church is better equipped to deal with that at individual level than the government. There's just a general real distrust of the government that I sensed or clearly heard from the people I interviewed. And so this distrust of the government's handling of that issue, believing that local communities or the church was better equipped to handle those issues. And I think that focus on the individual and the individual going out there and changing society, that's a long part of evangelicalism, really shapes their political and economic vision. It's more of a micro vision of the world rather than a macro vision of the world.
Question? David?
My question basically goes to your micro vision. How can you answer, and then, I can't even pronounce it, evangelical, when they say the earth is 7,000 years old? How do you produce that? How do you product that?
Right. I have a PhD student who's getting her PhD in education who's working with me right now because she wants to go into science education and try to develop practices for science teachers in public schools to try to address this very real issue. That there's really, significant opposition to biological sciences and theory of evolution behind it. In my work, I don't answer it. My job was to sort of, as a sort of like an anthropologist, just to go out and understand the culture and understand how they think about these things, rather than to try to debate with them about these issues. It's a whole worldview that starts with this base assumption that the Bible is inerrant, and anything that challenges that must be wrong in some way. And if it doesn't line up with an inerrantist understanding of the Bible, that's the base assumption of all their scientific pursuits or academic pursuits. So it's just that unshakable foundation that, and some Protestants have solved that by taking a different approach to the Bible, but for conservative Protestants, that's the core unshakable issue that makes you a true Christian.
What is, I know it's fairly soon after the election, but what's your prediction about how the evangelical Republicans are going to deal with how are they gonna win an election? I mean, how are they grappling with this? You got any
Right.
feedback on
Yeah, sure.
what they're doing right now?
Sure. One thing I heard over and over again, even before the election, was that seeing Hispanics as a potential population for recruiting into this movement on the social issues. And so the social conservative Republicans I talked to many of them were willing to completely just throw out the immigration, like do whatever needs to be done with the immigration issue to be able to capture Hispanics and bring them into the Republican Party based on the social issues like fighting abortion, fighting gay rights, things like that, that they think there would be an alliance or, connection with conservative Hispanic Catholics. I haven't followed this closely enough to know the details, but my hunch is that some of the movement we're seeing with immigration issues now, might be part of the sort of recalculating how to bring this growing population into the social conservative movement, and that be an avenue into the Republican Party for Hispanics.
I've got just a couple of questions, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. One thing that I heard during the campaign was that one of the things that the Romney campaign had banked on was that the evangelical vote would come out in force for him, but it was also a concern that evangelicals, as a rule, don't vote at the same percentage as the rest of the populace. Can you Then I've got one more after that.
Yeah, that's been an ongoing challenge to the social conservative movement, is that internally evangelicals are divided about how politically active should evangelicals be. There's still a strong belief within evangelicalism that the focus should be on preaching the gospel, spreading the good news, converting people into the religion, rather than putting a lot of effort into building grassroots political movement and going out and getting the vote out. So that's an ongoing just sort of struggle, and I think groups like Ralph Reed's Freedom Coalition, other groups have just really put a lot of effort into trying to get out that evangelical vote. And I think that it did help him in the election, even though it wasn't enough, of course. But they did get out a pretty good number, more than they were expecting, as many as came out for George W. Bush. So.
One last comment. I noticed about at least a year prior to the election, the I'm a Mormon campaign on television had kind of went out, and I had made a comment to my wife at the time saying that this is in preparation of Mitt Romney running for president, and that they're just trying to normalize and get everyone along the same page that this is a normal person. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that was important. I mean, the Mormon Latter-day Saint Church itself, has its own interest in normalizing the church. I could go and give a whole lecture on the whole history of anti-Mormonism, which is pretty profound in American history. And as that population grows really rapidly in the U.S., support for the church itself to make people feel comfortable with its presence. But certainly, the vast majority of Mormons are Republican, and certainly would have had an interest in the success of Mitt Romney. So yeah, it was strategically well done, I think.